Okay.
Welcome to another episode of Jews in the World. I'm Phyllis Zembler-Miller, and I'm very excited about our guest today, whose name is Anneke de Rudder. That's my attempt at German pronunciation. So I learned about her because she was given an Obermeyer Award for her work through Widen the Circle, and I will include that information link at the description of this podcast when I upload it. But what she does is she is a provenance researcher, and she's going to explain to you what that means. But what I'm really interested in is how her work at, I don't want to call it a micro level, but at even a book level rather than a, she'll explain, huge painting, valuable painting, has reunited families around the world. So, Anneke, take it away about your research and what this has led you to.
Okay, that's a big question. I'll try and answer. Yeah, provenance research, it sounds a little complicated, but it isn't. Provenance just means where do things come from? The provenance of things, where do they come from? And especially in terms of, are there any things in collections of museums or libraries or other institutions or even in private homes that have some kind of a difficult background, so that were acquired illegally or within a context of lawlessness, of coercion, in wars, or as part of some kind of persecution. So that could be what I'm doing is with in respect of with which concerns Nazi persecution, mainly of Jewish people, but also of people who were persecuted because of political beliefs or other kind of religious beliefs. And but it could also be a colonial context. So everything that was taken away, robbed, stolen during the colonial times. So that would mean not only things that Germans have done, but also Germans, but also, all the countries that were active in colonizing other nations. And also we have in Germany also the third context, which is during the time of the GDR, and also the time right after the war, when there was the Soviet zone of occupation in Germany, which was also a time where there was a lot of illegal acquisition of cultural goods. So what I do is I try to find the provenance, like where does it come from, of objects that are in a collection of a museum or a library, and where we have a certain suspicion that there might be something not quite right about it. And then I look into it and try to find out more about it. And if it turns out that there is actually either a background of illegal acquisition to it, robbery or confiscation or forced sales, then I try to find out who the original owner was. And as you can imagine, we're talking about the Nazi period here. They are no longer alive, or only in very, very few cases. So then I try to figure out who the descendants are, who the legal heirs of this person might be. And once I figure that out, I try to not only to find out about their names, but also where they live and how can I contact them. And then if all goes well, I write to them and I say, we found something here and we think it belongs to you. And we would like to return it to you because we have this policy of looking for these things and of trying to return them to their legal owners. So that's in a nutshell.
How long is this policy and who funds it in Germany?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also, I would like to say that this is something I do, but many, many people do it nowadays. Also in the States, there's also institutions, libraries and museums in the States that also have provenance researchers, and in other countries as well, but especially, of course, in Austria and Germany. So the places where it happened and where the perpetrators come from. And so this has started, I would say, sort of in the late 90s, early 2000s, because there was the Washington Declaration, which was all about getting together and trying to figure out how to deal with all these unresolved issues of things that were stolen during the war. So you remember that probably, the Swiss gold and the insurances, life insurances, and also there were so many people in Eastern Europe who had never gotten any kind of compensation. In Western Europe, usually in Germany and also in other countries, there had been some kind of financial compensation, but in the East there was nothing, and so these people were still waiting for justice to be done, and also many people, even in the West, still had never gotten any kind of restitution or compensation for things they had lost or that were taken away from them. So there was this whole thing in the 90s of trying to figure out what was still unsolved, especially regarding art, and then also books and just objects, and then of course the first people who did it were already working at a museum or at a library, and they had some kind of job working there, and then they discovered something and they just started to do it in their own time, maybe also as a volunteer more or less, or they cut off some part from their original job, but very soon people realized that this would not be enough. You needed some kind of proper, as you said, financing. There had to be funding for that. So there were different institutions, and nowadays it's called the German Lost Art Foundation. So that's something you could also like, if you give people links to institutions, that might be an interesting link. I can also send it to you if you want to. They have a website in German and in English. So, and that's you get a really good picture of what's going on. And this is funded by the German state. So we have like the federal and the state level and the communal level, and they all got together to fund this institution. And they're the ones really funding most of the projects. So my project that I'm working at now in Hamburg at the State Library is funded by them, and also the one I did before in Lüneburg at the smaller museum was also funded by this institution. But the problem is these are always projects. So, they're a couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years at the most. And then that's it. And then, as everybody knows, it's working in academia and in related fields, you have to start making a new application and getting together and starting to think of a new project. But the old projects usually are not finished by then. Sort of the project is finished, but the work is not
You mean
done
the
yet.
financing for the project is finished?
Yes, that's it. So, but and very often it means the project cannot be continued, and that's a huge problem. And this German Lost Art Foundation was actually put into place to sort of make it easier for institutions to start this kind of research. And they thought one day every institution will have their own provenance researcher, but that didn't go very well. Some of the really large museums have them. And for instance, at my library in Hamburg, which is also a pretty large university and state library, I have 2 colleagues who have a very, very small amount of their job description is provenance research, and then that's me. But that's it, but we're trying to do the work, and there's many of us. We have an association of provenance researchers, and there's like more than 400 people in it now, and that's basically the ones who are doing all this. So that's, as you said, it's a big issue. Where does the money come from? And there's also some other institutions who are funding this kind of research, especially if you're like a large institution and you manage to do not only provenance research, but some kind of larger look into the collections, or some kind of basic research that needs to be done, historical research. And then if you can have a kind of a bundle, and provenance research can be part of it. Yeah.
So let's talk about an example. Now, I had the opportunity to hear you talk about particularly the one family. You want to talk about the Heinemann's, right? Is that the right name?
Yeah, the one in Lüneburg. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's actually how I started to do this kind of research.
Oh, good. I was going to say, how did you? Okay, so I'll take you through the steps. Don't leave anything out. I'm just teasing.
No. You just have to interrupt me because that's a very long story. I'll just try. Okay. But you want me to tell it? Okay. So that has to do with it's a small town in the north of Germany, not too far from Hamburg. It's called Lüneburg. It's a very old town, very pretty. If you ever come there, it's a great place. Nice to visit. And there was a fairly small Jewish community since the late 1700s or 1600s even, yeah. And so, but then, there were certain Jewish families who'd been there for a long time and who were also very much identifying themselves with the history of this place. They started to collect artifacts, old Lüneburg items, furniture. There was like a stained glass windows, coins, some old books, and so on. So, but just something, they would have private collections, but they also, in the 19th century, when the museum was founded, they joined the Museum Association. They were very active in that. So they were working as bankers or merchants, but they would also have this very strong cultural interest, and they would engage themselves in all kinds of institutions and also in the museum. So they started to work together with the museum. They donated items to the museum, which are still here today, some of them. But they also had their own collections. And there was one person in particular. He was called Marcus Heinemann, and he was like one of the most the wealthiest people in town. And he was very much a socially active person. He would fund all kinds of good causes and be active within the Jewish community, but also within the town as a whole. So the town, just the community of the place. And he died in 1908. And he was, at the time, he was almost 90 years old, which was really old at the time. When he died, he was the oldest man in Lüneburg, in the whole town. So people didn't get that old in these days. And he was very well known. And he had 13 children with one wife. His wife was called Henriette. She was a wonderful woman. And there are many people who wrote down things they remembered about her, and they would always say she was just great, and she was always in a good mood, and she looked gorgeous. Some people said she actually looked better than most of her daughters, so whatever, I don't know. But so she had these 13 children, and only one or two died very young, and all the others grew to be adults. But she died after the last child was born. Not because she was sick, but the midwife gave her an infection. And so in the old days, in the 1870s, people would still die from silly infections. Yeah, so that's what happened. Anyway, so Marcus Heinemann was alone with all these children, and the older girls looked after the younger children, and they managed to get along somehow. And after he died, the house where the collection was, where the family lived, remained in the family. There were two daughters who had to remain at home to look after him and to look after the other children, so they never got married. And they lived until the 1930s. Actually, they lived until one died in 1934 and the other died in 1936. And then they gave the house to their youngest brother, and all the items that were in the house belonged to the family as a whole. And so when the Nazis came to power, they would constantly try to erase the memory of this wonderful person. So first thing they did, there was a street called after Marcus Heinemann in Lüneburg, and they changed the name. They turned it into a name of some Nazi activist. And they always try to erase the memory of this family. But they were very important, and they lived right in the middle of the town. And but it was still the house and everything that was in it was still owned by the family. And then in 1940, there was sort of this attempt to take away the last remnants of what was still there of Jewish life and of Jewish objects that were still owned by Jewish families. So they took away the house and everything that was in it. And there was a big auction in that house in the middle of the town. Yeah, and there is a list of this auction which gives you all the names of the people who went there and what they bought. Yeah, so you have Mr. So-and-so who bought so-and-so many plates, or they bought some kind of a blanket, or, that just stuff that was in the house. And I mean, that thing in itself is hard to imagine, but it happened very often. So people in the small town who knew exactly who had been living there and what all this was about, they just went there because they saw, oh well, that's a good opportunity, and that we can get stuff cheap from there. And this list still exists today. And that's always, of course, for us historians and researchers, that's always like a wonder, but it happens fairly often that we still find these lists from the auctions. And it was found by a kind of a hobby historian. His name is Hans-Jürgen Brennecke. He found the list. He was looking for something else. He went to the archives in Hanover where it's kept. And he saw on that list, there wasn't only Mr. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so, but there was also Museum Lüneburg. And they had bought objects in the auction. That's what it looked like. So he took the list and he went to the museum. This is more than 10 years ago. And he said, have a look at this. You should be looking into this. There's something not very something went on that is probably not right. And do you still have those objects? And what happened? And so they started to look, and they actually found a list that they still had somewhere in the back of the house. There was an old archive, which really nobody had looked at for a long, long time. So they looked at it and they thought, yeah, we really have to look into this. And so they applied for a grant from the German Lost Art Foundation. And they explained, and then the people from the Lost Art Foundation said, oh yeah, that's very interesting, because we, up to now, we have funded mainly projects in the large museums, which were about the big art, like the major paintings that were worth a lot of money. But this is so interesting to look into not only just smaller museums, but also things that are not that valuable, but the story is the same. The robbing and the taking away and the exclusion of people and not realizing or not wanting to realize what's happening, that's the same. So we would really like to fund this kind of research because we think it's an interesting project. And so they said, why don't you just, you could just do the Heinemann story, but you should also look into other things. You just check everything. Okay. And so they had the projects. They asked me if I wanted to do it because I had been active doing historical research for this region because I live very close. And so I started. And at the time, I had no idea what this was about. I remember that they said, yeah, we have a provenance research project. This was when it started, 2012 or something, no, 2012. And I thought, what is this exactly? And I remember Googling it and actually saying, I have to look it up. I had an idea, but I wasn't quite sure. Anyhow, so it started. And then just after I had started, there were all kinds of cases that came up in Germany and also elsewhere. I don't know if you remember, there was a guy called Gurlitt, Gurlitt. Yeah. And that was a famous case. And suddenly it came up all over, people started talking about it, and the Nazi looted art was suddenly a term that people had heard. And like this guy who had in his, you remember that he had this whole apartment full of art, and until now, people are still researching the provenance of these pictures. So that's a very complicated case, but it made the headlines, and people sort of started to think about it. So that was good for me because suddenly there was a big interest also in what I did. So what I did, the first thing, of course, I had to look into the history of this Heinemann, these objects, and the objects were still there. Most of them, not all of them, because the museum had been hit during the war by a bomb and many things had been destroyed. So many of the things were lost, but still some were still there. And I found a whole file, or they had already found it, I think, and I looked into it, and it turned out that what the museum did, they didn't go to the auction, but they talked to the people who organized the auction in advance, because they said there's some objects there that are so valuable and that shouldn't be given to private people, but they should be going to the museum. And also what they said Marcus Heinemann actually wanted these things to go into the museum, which was true. He had actually said that, and it was written down somewhere. But the daughter the last daughter to die, she said, I still want the will of my father that a certain, especially one object should go to the museum. I still think that's right, and it should go to the museum, but only if and when the room that's called after Marcus Heinemann in the museum still has its name. So she said, if it doesn't have the name Marcus Heinemann anymore.
Wait, let me clarify. Yeah. It had its name. It was taken away by the Nazis in the museum. Right. Wanted it put back.
She said this thing that before she died, she had a will, and she said, my father told me that he wanted certain things to go to the museum once there's nobody living in the house anymore. But And I think, she said, I want that too, because I'm very fond of the museum. But they have this room there, which was named after Marcus Heinemann because he donated so many objects. He actually financed a whole room, which would not have been there without him. So like a whole extension to the building. And so she said that it bears the name of Marcus Heinemann, but as soon as it doesn't have this name anymore, then the objects shall not go there. That was her will. And
Wait, and she died after the war?
she died in 36. We're now
She's
in
the one that died in
1940. We're now in 1940. And what happened? Of course, the name has been changed by now, you know. So, I mean, it's obvious. People knew that she had written this will. So it was completely crystal clear that this shouldn't have gone into the museum. But the museum's director said, no, Marcus Heinemann always wanted this to go to the museum. So, now and they actually paid something for it. But of course, the money didn't go to the Heinemann family, who at that time was scattered all over the world. They were either in the States, or they were in Palestine, or they were in France, or whatever. And some were still in Germany, but were living under really bad conditions. Some were killed in the Holocaust. So they didn't even try to find them, of course. They just said, oh, well, they're gone, we can do whatever we want. And this is very typical. So the story I'm telling is that's not, it's something that happened all the time with everything. And that's sort of this general thing that I think is so important, that we're not just, it happened all over the place. And it happened with houses, with cars, with objects, it happened with careers. I mean, just people who were working somewhere and the Jewish guy was no longer there. And they said, okay, I'm going to take his place, or whatever, anything. I mean, it's just, there was this void that people were just no longer there. And other people decided not to think about it and just to take the opportunity to benefit from that. And that's what the museum did as well. And it's just so wrong. But for a long time, this was considered completely normal. Even after the war, for many, many years, people just say, well, I mean, all these little things, who cares? That's just how it goes. Yeah. Anyhow, so they took it. They even paid money to this kind of trust that was there to. So it was like run by the state. So all the money went to the state. Okay. So none of the money ever went to the Jewish families, of course. And so they had the feeling that this was completely legal. They paid, they got it, and it was supposed to go to the museum anyway. So they got not only one of the sort of the major object, but also lots of other things. It was a list of, I think, 20 objects. And everything was there. And they were very proud, and they talked about it. Even in the press, they said, yeah, there was some really good new acquisitions. And they never said where it came from. The word, I mean, the family name wasn't used. Jewish, of course, wasn't used at all. So they just pretended this was, a normal thing. So when I started, it took me like, I don't know, 1 or 2 hours to look through the file. And I thought, okay, this is a clear cut case. It's Nazi looted goods. That's obvious. So now what? And then he had these 13 children, and he died in 1908. And I had to look for all the descendants of all the children who had grown, to adult age. And many of them had children. And there were people before me in Lüneburg who had also done research about the family, because it was such an important family. And there were so many of them. And some of the descendants had actually come to Lüneburg and visited those historians who had already done work about them and had tried to look for the graves of their ancestors and so on, and for the houses. So there had been some contacts. And so that's where I started. But of course, these contacts had sort of ended in the 1990s, I think, yeah. Late 1990s, there was nothing after that. Yeah, and then I started to to see if I could find anybody. And there's this wonderful American thing of having the obituaries, like, in local papers or in the New York Times or whatever. It's something we don't have that much. I mean, we have obituaries, but in the American obituaries, I always said at the end, who are the descendants? Like,
Yes,
so.
yes. You don't have that? That's really
No,
interesting.
no, not usually. No. And so not only does it give names, but very often it also says, her son so and so who lives in and their grandsons. And so I had a lot of names. That was, of course, very good. And And so I tried, I just started writing emails to different people. I tried different leads, and sometimes I wasn't sure if it was the right one. And the first replies I got were negative. There was one guy actually calling me saying, "Don't you dare, this is not the right family, and you've got the wrong one. And my mother is like 90 years old and she's completely confused, and please stop." And I was like, "Oh God, what am I going to do?" But then finally I found somebody, and this is Becky Cohn Vargas, who you've maybe met during the conversation. And she lives in California. She was an educator, and she's very much into anti-racism, and she writes books, and she's just this very open-minded and very active person. And I found her, and she was the first one to reply. And she said, she actually wrote to me and says, "You found the right one. I know that my grandmother and my mother are from the Heinemann family in Lüneburg. And I've never been there myself, but my mother went there fairly often." And so she was the first one to realize what was going on, really, I think. And she knew a couple of other people, and I had found some others. And then there were some people in Germany also, and in Israel. And so everything sort of fell into place, and we found more and more people. And there was also another cousin of hers in New York, Christina Heinemann. She was actually still called Heinemann. And so we got together, and we wrote emails every day for a long time, and we tried to figure out who else we could find. And then I remember Becky said, "Yeah, I remember that my Uncle Bob, he died, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. He had this little notebook, and he had like the addresses of everybody in the family." And so she managed to find Uncle Bob's notebook, and then that was just amazing, because we found some, I think 3 or 4 or 5 more people. And I had all kinds of other ways of finding people. And so, but what she did, and that was so important, because that's always a problem. Like, we find the people, but then if it's a large group of heirs, they have to decide what to do. So what we do is we say, we found it, and we've established that it belongs to you, and you're the heirs. And now what? And then the heirs have to get together and decide what they want to do, because they can, of course, just take it. But you can imagine, when there's so many heirs and the things are not very valuable, what do you do? And some of the objects were pretty big also, so it's not something you can just put into your apartment. It's and then, of course, if there's, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 heirs, who takes what? So it's starting to get difficult there. And just taking it all and then selling it, that would be difficult as well. And these things don't sell too well very often, because they're just not that valuable. So who's going to do that? And so they thought about that for some time. And there's also always also the possibility of just saying, we're going to there's going to be a restitution, and then it belongs to the family, and then the family can sort of give it back to the institution as a loan or as a gift. And Becky was the one who got everybody together, and who sort of talked to all of them, and then they decided that this is what they were going to do. So they said, "Okay, we want to have it back, but like a formal restitution, but not in kind, and then we will return it to the museum as a gift, or as well, they made a loan for 10 years, which is now they have to think about renewing it, or what they want to do."
And so wait, let me clarify. Is the room back to being named for Marcus Heinemann?
Yeah, that's also interesting. Yeah. So the room was no longer there, because where the room had been, that was actually the part of the museum that was destroyed during the war. So they never renamed it. But wait, it's going to come back again later. Okay. So so they said, "Okay, we want to do the restitution, and then we want to give it to the museum." And then Becky and I thought, this is such a great story. And we had found, I think, like 40 people by then, all over the globe. And they didn't know each other. Man, some of them did, but I mean, they knew maybe their first and second cousin, but it went so far back in time, because of this whole difficult situation, that of course there were people who didn't even know existed. Maybe their parents or their great parents would still have known, but people in this generation didn't know. So it was just a wonderful and a weird thing. And we thought, let's make something out of this. And so we had this idea of having a big family gathering of all the Heinemann descendants in Lüneburg to do the restitution. And it actually, yeah, it came to be. And I was in 2015, I think. Yes, I started in 14 and I was in 15. And then everybody got together, and that's when the museum renamed a hall after Marcus Heinemann, which is like the main hall where whenever the museum is having some kind of discussion or a talk or whatever, or people meet there, it's always the Marcus Heinemann hall. And I think that is just wonderful, because if you open the paper today in Lüneburg, every day you will see some kind of event, and it will say, the venue is Marcus Heinemann Hall at the museum. And that's just great. The street was renamed right after the war, so in 45 already they renamed the street after him.
Interesting.
But
and did you do an exhibit of the family for those younger generations who don't know about the family?
That's it. Yeah, so we had everybody, so people came around, and there were some pretty young people there. I think the youngest were like 10 or 12, and of course, many of them didn't know anything. So what I did together with my colleagues, I made this huge family tree, which was like a couple of meters wide and a couple of meters high. And because and we had, I think, 7 generations. And I tried to find not only the names, but also pictures of everybody. And so we had these little lines going from who the people who belong together. So that was great. And that was also so much fun when they all came and they stood in front of this huge family tree. And they would all say, this is my great aunt so-and-so. And then somebody said, yeah, that's also my great aunt so-and-so. And they realized how the whole family belonged together. And I got together all my colleagues and lots of volunteers, because I said I need people who speak English or French or whatever, because these people don't speak German, most of them. And so we had a whole group of volunteers, and also a young volunteer who was working at the museum anyhow. And we all got together and organized I think 2 or 3 days of programs. So we went to all the places where the family had lived. I talked to the people living there now, and they were all very, very open about it. And they said, okay, yeah, you can come around. So we came around with like 40 people traipsing through the homes and the offices. And that was very moving, especially the house of Marcus Heinemann. There's a lawyer who has his offices there now, and he was really very open about it. And we walked through, and there were the old doors and the old handles of the doors. They were still there. You could tell they were from the 19th century. And suddenly everybody was really moved, because you had this feeling that you were touching something that Marcus Heinemann and all his children had touched every day when they were still living there. And that was just incredible. And it was a very, very strong powerful emotion and realization for everybody, I think. So even if there were some people in the family who weren't really too interested in this whole old history, but this was, I think, something that got to them. Yeah.
What I think is really important is what it did for the town.
Yeah.
And it told them about, it brought their Jewish heritage to the forefront. And to me, this is very important.
Yeah.
And a course that I just finished taking called Jewish Heritage through Central European University. It was remote. I did not go to Vienna for it. The question that was asked, that I've been thinking about, was that there's a menorah from a small town in Germany. They know which town, and it's in the Israel Museum in Israel, in Jerusalem. And the question is, should that menorah be returned to the small town in Germany, or should it remain in Israel? And I came down on the side of the fact that I think it should be returned to the small town in Germany, with the understanding that they do an exhibit about Jews in that town, to remind people that Jews did live there for hundreds of years and what they contributed. That this is a chance, we call it a teachable moment, that this is a chance for a teachable moment. And I've been to the Israel Museum as recently as last summer, 2023. They don't need any more menorahs. They really don't. I think it should go to this a small town in Germany. So that's why I'm so thrilled with this project, that you didn't just do this for the heirs, but for the whole town.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't really talk about it that, but yeah, I mean, of course, that's always harder to tell because there's so many more people. But judging from the reactions, it touched everybody who was there. I mean, this restitution, we had many people who were there. It was open to the public. Everybody could come, and it was just a very moving experience. And even now, I sometimes meet people who said, I am so glad that I could join the group for that event, especially because it's not just the objects, but it's all the people, and also for the people living in these houses today. I mean, that's all fine, that's all legal because there's been compensation,
Great,
everything
great,
is
great,
in the
great.
clear. So so these people are living there completely legal now, and then they don't have anything to do with the people who took it away at some point, which of course makes it easier. But for them, I think that was such a strong bond they have with his family, because they realize that, yeah, as you say, we're not only talking about Jewish life during the Holocaust or during the Nazi period, but centuries before that. So these houses are, there's some very old Lüneburg houses, and they had actually, sometimes families had lived there for 200 years almost, and there was a long story, and they were usually shopkeepers and bankers, which was the only thing they were allowed to do for a long time.
I was talking about
So
the Jews.
everybody in town knew them. Everybody would buy their things there, and that, I think that's very important, and also something that I've been trying to. I mean, people are probably sick of me now in Lüneburg, but whenever I go anywhere, I say we have to find the descendants. We always have to find them. If it's a stumbling stone, or if it's some kind of exhibition, if we put a name on the wall, we have to find people who are still alive from these families and ask them and tell them about it. Because what I always find a little strange is all this, what they sometimes call Shoah business, like all the memorials and the stumbling stone and everything. And that's great. I'm so glad we're doing it, and we have to do it, and we have to do much more, and we should have done it much earlier. But very often it happened in all these German towns without the Jews. It's just the Germans among themselves. All the Jews were, I mean, if there were more Jewish Germans, it would be different. But in these small towns, like in Lüneburg, they're actually gone. There might be one or two Jews living there, but there's no Jewish community. There's no Jewish life visible. And so it's basically the people doing it, on their own. And so that's something I think that has started to change in this small town, that whenever they do something nowadays, they always try. I mean, because I have all the addresses now, and I always give them to everybody. And so I have this growing number of people who have on my email list, and so I always write to them, say, hey, something new is going to happen, and whenever we do anything, we invite them, and so I think that's very important, to realize that we're not only doing that for ourselves, but we're doing it for everybody. We're doing it for the descendants, and we're doing it for the people in the town, as you say, because it's so important to realize that there was something, and it's not hard to find. There's still so much. Once you know it, you realize what's going on. And so that's probably, and I don't know. No, okay, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, growing up in a small town with very few Jews, Elgin, Illinois, in the Midwest of the United States,
Yeah.
I I think especially in places that no longer have any Jews, that this history is very important. Particularly, I do a lot of work fighting anti-Semitism. And I think that when Jews are some people that live, far away, they're not so real. But when you understand that they're part of the fabric of your history, of your town, I think it changes things in very positive
Yes.
ways.
Yes. And that's also why I always stress the fact that, and that's also the same actually in the library in Hamburg where I work now. I always stress the fact that these collectors, these people, these Jewish people felt so much part of the German history, that they actually started collecting things about, you know, the history of their town, or the history of, or they got interested in authors, or they you know, they collected autographs, or they collected books. So that's what I'm working with now. And it wasn't Jewish books or Jewish authors or Jewish objects. It was just cultural objects that belonged to the region or to the literary tradition or whatever of the place where they lived. And I'm not saying they were completely accepted or part of the larger community, because, you know, there was anti-Semitism always, and Jews were always barred from certain things, and that took a long time, even in the 1840s when emancipation started and so on. But it took a long time before you could actually do whatever you wanted. And I mean, even it was on paper, but still they were part of the general community somehow, and they felt very much responsible for this community as a whole. Probably also because it was one of the, I mean, it has this thing of you know, trying to overcome anti-Semitism by being overly patriotic, maybe, or, you know, overly engaging in social issues. That's probably part of the thing, but still, and you know, because many, I'm often asked, so what kind of objects are you looking into? Are you looking into menorahs, or you know, Torah scrolls, or, you know, Jewish ritual objects? And I'm saying, no, no, you know, I'm talking about regular books which Germans in the 19th century or around the turn of the century just had in their homes, you know, like all the other people, you know, they were not, there wasn't much of a difference. There was probably some kind of Jewish ritual objects, and there were some books maybe on Jewish topics, but the people we are talking about, these largely assimilated, very secular German Jews, you know, the Yekis, they were just not, it
Yes,
was just a
Becky.
special kind of people, you know that.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and
So
culture was a big thing, and history and literature, and just being responsible for the community as a whole.
yes,
Mm.
and as we come to a close, I just want to say that in 2016, when I was in Berlin and stood in front of the bust of Nefertiti, is when I first learned that
Yes.
fabulous bust was all because James Simon, a very important Jewish benefactor, really put Berlin culturally on the world map. But he funded the archaeological trip that found Nefertiti, and the same thing as you were telling the story. His name was on various things in the museum
Yes.
and the various museums in Berlin. Not and as soon as the Nazis came, he was erased. But now there's a new part, the James Simon Gallery, connecting the
Yeah.
Museum Island,
Yes. Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think that's so wonderful.
That is, yeah, yes, yeah, and that's, I think also that naming of places is also. I mean, you can always have objects. You can have, you know, a showcase
Right.
with glass, and we have that in Lüneburg, and we also in Hamburg at the library, we also have these not permanent exhibitions, but we also, you know, we show different cases and so on, and we talk about them. But having a place named after somebody, it's a very strong symbol, and it's something that's it's living, you know, it's breathing, because things are happening there.
Exactly.
And so I'm very glad that the museum decided to do that. And also we, you know, we didn't only name it, but there's also a picture of him at the wall, and you know, and in the beginning we had little leaflets telling the story of the family. Yeah, so,
I
and so that it's I mean, I think what's interesting about bringing, and maybe that's also something that I feel very strongly about, is not just doing the provenance research, like telling the story of the objects, which is also very often very interesting, especially if it's more valuable objects who were sold and given, you know, and inherited a couple of times, and it's really well, just exciting to, if you can read the story of an object on the object itself, if it has little signs, or, you know, if you have a book, you have a book plate, you have an autograph, you have some kind of sign pointing to various people who owned it. So that's great, and I really like doing that. But then the objects have, this, like, their own life in terms of what they convey, and then the stories behind it and the stories of the people. And I mean, there's sometimes you have people who get this call or a letter from a German library, and they say, we found a book and it's got the name of your great grandfather or whatever, and the book as such isn't interesting, but sometimes you have people, and then they don't come over if it's just for one book or two. It's usually not like we did in Lüneburg, because it was such a special story, but usually things are just sent by mail or with a carrier, whatever. So we send the books, and then we get these letters back, and sometimes people write, this is the only thing that we have that has the name of this person. There is nothing left. Either somebody emigrated and couldn't take anything with him, or he was killed, and so that has such an amazing connection through this. So it's not the object, but it's it's like a link between two worlds, and also to many centuries, and so that's, I mean, before I started doing this research, I wasn't aware of the power that these little objects might have. And it's not about the value, it's about the story behind it.
That's a beautiful ending story behind it, unless you want to add anything else. But I just think your enthusiasm and passion has just been revealed about how important this micro level project. You understand, I'm using that because, we've seen the movie Woman of Gold about the Klimt paintings, etc. That's a different level. But this is a very individual, personal family. I have a prayer book from my grandmother that I'm named for. And I mean, those little things can be very meaningful because she held it in her hand, as you said. And as an example, you said, and I just think it's wonderful what you're doing. I hope you get funded for more and more projects.
Yeah, we'll see. I just wanted to add, I don't know, we talked about this very briefly before. You wrote about it, that from this project there was a sort of a general research into the history of Jewish families in Lüneburg, and I have this website which started only last year. I don't know if you saw it. It's called Jewish Life in Lüneburg.
But if I don't have, I think I have the link, and if not, we'll share it, okay, in the description.
Yes, and that's also that's a pretty new thing, and I'm really excited about it because it's ongoing work and ongoing research, and I'm sort of working to fill it up, and the idea is that that people in the States or wherever, all they have to do is just type in the name, and then there it is, and they find the connection, and the more research I do, the more exciting it gets, because of course it's a small town, and many of the Jews living there in the 19th century or the 18th century left and went to other places and started new families and did really exciting things all over the globe. And there's many people went to the States or to Israel or just different countries. And and I'm so that's also an important part, that we have to make sure that all the information we find is made available, is made transparent for everybody. So it cannot be that we're keeping this as a part of just a sort of a scientific community or academic community. We have to share it. Of course, there's certain things that maybe you don't want or shouldn't be sharing, but that's something I just wanted to stress, that it's happening all over now. Lots of regions, lots of towns are starting these websites, and I think that's where we have to put the work into this, because there's so many books, but how do you find them? And so it's important to digitize this and to get the information into databases and to make them really searchable on the internet. And I hope that many people are going to find it and write to me if they know anybody or if they know anything else. Yeah.
I just want to thank you again. Really, this has been to me I'm the family historian, and I just think this is so very important what you're doing. And so I thank you. I thank our listeners, and stay tuned for our next episode. Bye.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. That was so much fun. And if there's anybody who would like to ask me anything, you can really give out my address also, and they can just talk to me and write to me.
Excellent.
Okay. So thank